All right, so I've been a little negative as it relates to a galaxy far, far away, but not this week on a Star Wars show. We have Rey Movie Updates, plus why Star Wars is still pretty awesome, and your listener feedback this week. Thank you so much for taking time out of your valuable day to check out this week's episode. Let's get to it.
It's an instinct. A feeling. The Force brought us together. We're not alone. Good people will fight if we lead them.
People keep telling me they know me. No one does.
But I do.
Long have I waited. And now you're coming together. Is your undoing.
Confronting fear is the destiny of a Jedi. Your destiny. The Force will be with you.
Always.
My Nerd World.
And welcome to My Nerd World. My name is Jon Justice. I'm your host for a Star Wars show. And again, thank you so much for taking time out to listen to my musings about a galaxy far, far away. Now, if you are new to the show, I hope you'll go to mynerdworld.net, check out my science fiction space opera series, EMBARK. It's how you can support My Nerd World, and I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the show. It's also available on Amazon.com. For you frequent weekly listeners to the show, thank you so much for checking out the show every week. I really do appreciate it, and I love to hear from you. As always, you can email TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or if you happen to be listening on YouTube, you can leave a comment there as well. I love getting feedback from those of you that listen and download the show every single week. And be sure to like and subscribe to however you listen to a Star Wars show here on My Nerd World. Now, if you are a frequent listener to the show, you know that over the course of the past few weeks, given some of the news that's been dominating the headlines relating to Star Wars and that galaxy far, far away, I've been somewhat negative on the show. I've been frustrated, like a lot of people, over some of the comments made by future Star Wars content creators, but I want to pull back on that this week. And let me go there with kind of how my week has transpired and talk a little bit about why Star Wars is still awesome. We do have some movie updates to share, courtesy of Hollywood insider Jeff Snyder. We'll get to that here in just a moment. But I've been consuming a lot of Star Wars content and commentary from other channels. And it reached a level on my YouTube feed where I was getting inundated with this barrage of negative videos relating to Star Wars and comments made by specifically Charmin Obaid-Chinoy, the director of the new Rey film. When is that movie going to come out? Has it been canceled? I'll give you updates on all that stuff. And I've been frustrated a lot by these comments. I'm also aware that, cameras haven't even begun rolling yet. Casting hasn't been announced, and as far as we know, it sounds as if a script isn't even finished for that film, which is why the Mandalorian and Grogu film got greenlit, which we talked about on last week's show, which I am very much excited over. This sent me down a path of rewatching over the course of the past week some Mandalorian content, and I actually just finished up a rewatch of the Book of Boba Fett. And my perspective has shifted towards the positive again. But let me tell you another story about what happened. As I was clearing out my feed, because you can go into YouTube and you can tag videos that you're just not interested in. I was removing a bunch of this negative commentary in these videos that were popping up. And I watched a few of these, and they were interesting. Some of them go too far overboard in their negativity, but I was really curious to see what others' opinions were of the commentary around this potential Star Wars content in the future. So as I'm clearing out my feed, other items began popping up, and I love watching videos from Star Wars collectors, their own collections, their man caves. I like watching videos doing unboxing of new toys, and I love those videos that are focused on those old vintage toys that got me into collecting as a young kid, and the algorithm was picking up on this as well. There was one video that popped up, and it was a two-part series focusing on science fiction-themed toys that were inspired from Star Wars, some that came out before Star Wars and some that came out afterwards. And I was like, oh, this is interesting, because I saw on the thumbnail some toys that I had as a kid. So I began watching these videos, and I went down this road of nostalgia and saw toys from when I was a little kid that I hadn't seen since the 70s and early 80s. And I was reminded that at the time growing up, we certainly weren't poor by any standard, but at the same time, we also weren't rich. And I remember, and I've told this story on previous episodes about how the first Star Wars toys that I got was the original release of R2D2 and C-3PO. I actually still have them in the cabinet behind me. And how I was given those two action figures after a trip to the dentist that I was worried about. I remember that one holiday, one Christmas season, around the years of the release of The Empire Strikes Back, one of the toys I was most looking forward to was getting the Imperial Snow Trooper. And that is also sitting in the cabinet behind me, and how excited I was to get my hands on these toys. But watching this video of the other science fiction toys that were created during that time period that were much less expensive, I suddenly now got a snapshot of my youth that I hadn't really, in a perspective I hadn't really seen before. And that was being gifted these toys that weren't Star Wars, but were kind of like Star Wars, but they were obviously cheaper than the Star Wars toys. And there were a couple of lines that really stuck out to me. One that I thought was really funny was this Micronauts series. And for those of you that are old enough, you know what I'm talking about. What I had forgotten was how interchangeable the Micronauts toys were. And I chuckled to myself because one of the elements in my science fiction series EMBARK was, especially in book one, it kind of faded after book one, but one of my ideas in the first story was how this technology was all interchangeable within itself, how the vehicles could be customized and parts could be swapped out relatively easily among the characters of the story. I thought Fast and Furious in space, and how the youth in a world where flight culture and space flight had replaced car culture, where the youth treated their spaceships essentially like they did the customization of the cars in Fast and Furious in those early films. And I realized that, oh my gosh, my inspiration for that goes all the way back to when I was a little kid, back in 79 and 80 in the Micronauts series. Seeing the Fisher-Price action series and one of the space shuttle-esque ships that I remember I just absolutely loved as a child, and I hadn't seen it in decades. Since I was a kid. All of this reminded me, because comparatively, when you compare those toys to what we were getting in Star Wars, there really was no comparison. I loved it because it was science fiction. They were scaled to be played with, just like the Star Wars toys, but they weren't Star Wars toys, and they weren't even close to being as cool as Star Wars. And that got me thinking about just how awesome Star Wars is. And how when it comes to science fiction and what Star Wars does, whether it's old or new, it still does it better than anybody. And Star Wars, at its worst is still better than most other space opera at its best. I also watched this video essay done by Movies with Mikey, and I've talked about Movies with Mikey before. He does some of the most amazing video essays on films available on YouTube. It's not everybody's cup of tea. He is very modern in the way that he crafts his essays. He's he's got to be a millennial. And he includes a lot of millennial items in the videos, and so if you're older, you may not get some of the references unless you follow this stuff. There was one Star Wars video that he did just called Rise, and I believe this was done probably about a year and a half ago, and it was focused on the rise of Skywalker. But the video itself was Movies with Mikey and the host Mikey saying how this was going to be his last Star Wars video. He's done several in the past, and I would encourage you that if you listen to this show, go and check out Movies with Mikey and his past Star Wars video essays. They are absolute must-watch content. This one about the Rise of Skywalker I hadn't watched before, and it was really, really enjoyable. And I took a lot from that video, and again, much like my trip down nostalgia road, it brought back my appreciation of that galaxy far, far away. And he made a comment in that where he said, we get out of Star Wars what we put into it. And seeing in the video the comparisons to, let's just say, for example, the goofiness of Star Wars, going back to the original trilogy to things that we see in the Rise of Skywalker. And he's right when he says in his video essay, Star Wars has always been goofy. And he makes a lot of different comparisons like that. And he's absolutely correct. We take our Star Wars way too seriously. And I think there's if somebody wants to argue that over the course of the last few episodes that I've taken my Star Wars fandom a little too seriously, I probably have. I'll be honest with you. But I'm glad that I was able to come back down to earth, land my X-Wing, and realize that on this planet that we're on, Star Wars is still really awesome. To the point that I went back and watched the Book of Boba Fett in its entirety. I wanted to watch season 3 of The Mandalorian, but I really wanted to get those 2 Mandalorian-themed episodes in, and just decided to do a rewatch over the course of a week as I was doing my show prep for my radio show, my weekly radio show, and I went back and watched the Book of Boba Fett. And while I have issues with some of the storytelling and the creature creation and some of the effects and the way that final battle plays out, it still is a lot of fun. I've got my issues with Kenobi, but I'll go back and watch the Kenobi series, and I'll skip through some of the parts that I don't like nearly as much. It's not crafted as well as other content. But I go and watch Ahsoka, and episode 4 of that series, which is probably my single favorite piece of live-action Star Wars content, in that it really encapsulates everything in one about 50-minute episode. And this would be the episode right before the World Between Worlds episode with Ahsoka. This is the one after they land on the planet where they have the confrontation with Shin Hati and with Baylan Skoll, and Ahsoka and Padme get separated. You've got all the elements for me that I love about Star Wars: the mythology, the humor, the action, the spaceships at the end when the X-Wing squadron, the Ghost and Hera show up at the end. And it's absolutely amazing Star Wars storytelling and so much fun. But I was so thankful that I was able to go down this road and go back to appreciating Star Wars and everything that it has to offer, because again, Star Wars science fiction is still better than the majority of science fiction and certainly space opera that's available otherwise. And case in point would be Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon.
Something inside me has always been there. But now it's awake. And I need help.
one of the things in that video essay that from movies with Mikey that he pointed to was some of the comparisons, and they're loose comparisons, but he talked a little bit about the popularity of Twilight, the storytelling in Twilight, and specifically the sequel trilogy, and it reminded me of how much I enjoy the Reylo storyline. I did my own little video essay, not even close to being up to par with what Movies for Mikey does, or what a majority of people do on YouTube. But I did my own Reylo video on how it was the greatest Star Wars love story ever told. And I still stand by that. I love that story between Rey and Kylo Ren. And I know that I'm in the minority, but I like the way that it played out and culminates at the end of The Rise of Skywalker, which continues to be still one of my favorite Star Wars movies in all of its flaws and goofiness as well. Let's talk a little bit about the news that has broke. We've discussed over the course of the past few weeks all of the different news stories that have come out relating to whether or not Daisy Ridley's movie is going to happen, the controversial statements made by the director Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy. Hollywood insider Jeff Snyder put out in a recent podcast a series of insights into what's happening right now, and it's a nice little culmination of where we are in the Star Wars storytelling based off of this Hollywood insider, and he's got a really good track record, and I wanted to share it with you this week. So first off, the Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy and Stephen Knight scripted Rey movie is not in jeopardy, despite previous reports. It is proceeding at a normal pace, even though it's been shuffled in the release lineup. And Stephen Knight is set to deliver his draft soon. For those that don't know, Stephen Knight is the writer on the series Peaky Blinders on Netflix, of which my wife and I have been watching and really enjoying. Been really enjoying that series. So it looks like the Rey movie is still moving forward. Jeff Snyder, this Hollywood insider, believes that the Mandalorian and Grogu film, as we reported last week here on My Nerd World, is most likely slated for that May 2026 release slot, with potentially the Daisy Ridley post The Rise of Skywalker film coming out in December of 2026. Now, I think there's a little bit of rumor and speculation around there, because if I remember correctly, that's when the next Avatar comes out. Unless that comes out at the end of 2025, which it might be, and so in which case December 2026 will be an off year for the Avatar releases. Because I can't imagine for a second that Disney is planning on releasing an Avatar film at the same time as a Star Wars movie, especially with how well those Avatar films are destined to be. Rey is also rumored to appear in a potential Sean Levy Star Wars film that's been talked about quite a bit as well. Daisy Ridley is reported to be getting a $12.5 million paycheck for her movie, and Hollywood insider Jeff Snyder hinted that other talent from The Force Awakens is being courted for similarly large paychecks to go and do the film. This goes back to what I said many podcasts ago, that the best move for Disney at this point would be to make essentially an episode 10. You had billions of dollars made off the sequel trilogy, despite the commentary around them. You have an audience that was very young when those movies came out. The characters from the sequel trilogy are their Star Wars on the big screen. They will show up to see the next film in a series. It seems like the most logical thing to do beyond a Mandalorian and Grogu film. Now, to the Mandalorian and Grogu film, it's also being speculated that what's happened here is that Bob Iger, desperate to get a good film out for Star Wars as soon as they can, the scripts for, according to Jon Favreau, have been written for Season 4 of The Mandalorian. The word is, and it's being speculated, that perhaps the Mandalorian Grogu film could be the finale of that season. So where we would get on television, we would get on streaming Season 4 of The Mandalorian, but the last few episodes in the series would then be turned into a film. I put a bit of a question mark on that. The last time that I remember that happening, you got to go back into the 90s and the X-Files. For those that followed the X-Files, the X-Files movie was actually a culmination of what was taking place on the show. Now, you could watch it as a standalone film, but it was an extension of what was taking place on TV and served as that season's finale. So, it is being discussed that perhaps the end of Season 4 of The Mandalorian has been retooled into a film. I heard another commentator say that there's potential conflict there, and I agree with how do you make the film look? Do you make The Mandalorian Season 4 look like a film so it matches the movie, or do you make the movie look like Mandalorian Season 4, in which case you're going to have some continuity errors? Now, I have also heard continuity errors isn't the right word. It'll look different going from a television show to a streaming show to a movie version. It won't flow neatly. Okay. That being said, you go back, and I've said this many times on the show, you go back and look at the sequel trilogy, and it's night and day in terms of the way that The Last Jedi looks compared to the way The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker looks. Jeff Snyder also speculated that the James Mangold first Jedi Star Wars origin story will hit theaters in December of 2027. That would be the following year. And then we wouldn't get Dave Filoni's Mandoverse culmination film until sometime in 2028. So maybe May of 2028, which seems really far out to me, but based off of the number of films that they are trying to produce, I suppose that's possible. So that's the latest in terms of where we are with the movie releases. The surest bet, in my opinion, is The Mandalorian and Grogu film probably being in that May 2026 slot, which is still a pretty far ways out. And as I talked about on last week's show, I mean, think about the distance that you're going to have from anything being told as it relates to The Mandalorian if we have to wait until May of 2026 until we get a movie. The part about this whole thing that I just find amazing is I know that there was COVID in the middle of this. One of the points made in that Movies with Mikey video essay was that Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker was the last film that a lot of people saw in theaters before COVID hit, coming out December of 2019, and then COVID hitting right afterwards. We ended up going to see the Disney film Onward. That was the last movie that I saw in theaters before COVID hit. But it'll be seven years between The Rise of Skywalker and the next movie potentially that we see on the big screen. That's insane to me that Disney has allowed that to happen. And it tells you again to the kind of mess that Disney has been in. I'm not going to go all negative again, but there is no denying the tough situation that Disney is in right now, and just what a mess this behemoth of a corporation that used to be able to do no wrong has gotten themselves into. You own a franchise like Star Wars. You own that IP, and it's taking you 7 years to get another movie out. I mean, that's just absolutely amazing to me. I mean, also, again, putting things into perspective, COVID turned the whole planet upside down, and we're still dealing with the ramifications of that on a weekly basis. So I suppose in that sense, contextually, it's no surprise that Disney and Lucasfilm have not been able to get a Star Wars film out for 7 years.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
Not going to lie, it's been quiet on the listener feedback. So I want to hear from you. Reach out. TalkShowNerd at gmail.com. Leave a comment up on YouTube as well. Friend of the show, SheVP, however, writes, "This is why we love you, John, because you keep it real." Not everybody, Sheevy, but I do appreciate the comments. Thank you very much. She goes on to say, "I'm so excited. Din is my favorite Star Wars character, and I can't wait to see him on the big screen. I hope Pedro is in it. Now that Grogu is his son, he can take his helmet off around him, so he better be in it. Got to see that interaction, LOL." Yeah, I would imagine that this being a motion picture, that this being a film, that we will definitely see Pedro Pascal in it. Now, you may not see him in the actual series if they do make The Mandalorian and Grogu the end of Season 4, but I think it's a pretty safe bet you'll end up seeing Pedro Pascal back in the suit. All right, that wraps up the show for this week. Thank you so much for checking it out, as always. For those of you that have listened before, again, thank you for listening. I hope to hear from you. Leave me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com, or leave a comment up on YouTube. If you're a new listener to the show, I'm an author. I wrote a series of science fiction stories because of my love of Star Wars, and I was inspired by George Lucas. I wanted to know what it was like to go and create my own universe, but I wanted to make it something different. So I wrote book 1 in my EMBARK series back in 2018, which turned into a 7-book series. I hope you'll take a moment and go and check out book 1 in my series. It's available in ebook, audiobook, paperback, and hardcover. And you can actually purchase those paperbacks and hardcovers directly from me. But go and pick up the ebook up on Amazon.com or mynerdworld.net. Here's the story for book 1 in my EMBARK, a science fiction space opera series. As Earth faces its end, follow pilots Taft, Katha, and their crew on a journey of survival across the galaxy as they fight for humanity's future. Katha Morrow's usually steady hands shook just enough to notice as she zipped up her flight suit. After receiving a cryptic message from her late aerospace engineer father detailing an undisclosed location, she was desperate to reach the destination with fellow pilot Taft Guardia. Unprepared for what would happen next, they make a shocking discovery. Meanwhile, an industrial accident inside a D-Corp military spacecraft factory sparks a global evacuation as the Mecha Corporation's ruthless leader attempts to exploit the disaster. Unwittingly tied to the catastrophe, Katha Taft and their ragtag crew must solve the mystery of her father's past, having found what may be the only hope of saving Earth's evacuees from annihilation. Prepare for an action-packed thrill ride that'll take you from Earth to the far reaches of the galaxy. Treat yourself, a friend, or a family member with science fiction today. Written for adults, but great for ages 11 plus. Buy EMBARK Book 1 on Amazon.com, or you can head on over to mynerdworld.net and click on the link right there on the homepage. Book 1 in the series on ebook is available for just 99 cents, and if you're on Kindle Unlimited, you can download it today. Plus, you can purchase those paperbacks or hardcovers of any of the 7 books in the series directly from me. If you don't want to purchase them from Amazon, just email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com. If you are a reader and you like your science fiction space opera to be epic, filled with romance and action, EMBARK is perfect for you. Again, on Amazon, Jon, Jon Justice, or mynerdworld.net. I hope wherever you are happy, you're healthy, and you're safe. Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode, and I'll talk to you again next week. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.